Hi everyone, welcome to IVED 2022 debate briefing. So in this briefing, we're going to talk about some kind of basic stuff about what is Australian parliament format, how it looks like, what you need to do, what you need to know. Probably because we also recognize there are a lot of novice debater or debaters that are still new in the circuit that probably still need some guidance from us. So we're also going to talk a little bit about the general rules. We're going to talk about the speaker roles, the time of motion, and such. All right, so let's start this presentation. The first thing that you need to know is that what is oscillation format? Because probably some of you is not really familiar with that format, because probably you all this time only know two kind of format, like Asian parliamentary and British parliamentary. But yeah, it's like Asian parliamentary, but with a little bit of twist. So it is a 3-on-3 debate. So you're going to have two teams, affirmative and negative, and you have three speakers in each team, like AP. One team representing government, another team representing opposition. Your case building time is also 30 minutes. But the difference is that each speaker would speak for 8 minutes and at max 8 minutes and 20 seconds for their substantive speech, and 4 minutes and 20 seconds at max for their reply speech. Again, reply speaker should come from the first and second speaker. And another twist is that POI is not allowed. So the twist of Australasian format from the AP or Asian format are two things. First of all, the speaking time. Second of all, the POI, you're not going to have POI. So probably for some of you that do not like to take any POI, it's a good thing for you. You have the full 8 minutes for yourself. All right, continue. This is a general overview of how the debate should be and the flow of the debate. You will start the debate with the Prime Minister or the first speaker of the affirmative or government bench. Then it continues by leader of opposition, then deputy prime minister, deputy leader of opposition, government whip, opposition whip. But then you will start with opposition reply first, and then government reply will close the debate. So it will start from the government team. So it also will be closed by the government team. All right, next. General things that you need to know are the team roles, which are the 3 burdens that most of the time the team needs to fulfill. First of all, logical burden, which means you need to elaborate the likelihood and impact of your claim. So it is not the battle of which team bring the most argument, but which argument is more compelling by having a deep elaborations like likelihood and impact of your claims. So what you should question yourself in order for you to reach that burden is that why your argument is important. What are the factors that will supplement your claims to be more solid? What are the impacts and why they are likely to happen? Second burden is that motion-based burden, which means you need to address the key issues asked by the motions, which mean that you debate within the scope demanded by the motion, which I also would like to talk about the different type of motions and the specific burden that the motion would like to impose. So yeah, bear with me. Thirdly, the comparison or framing, which means that you actively compare yourself with all of the opponent's contribution, which means in making comparison, it's not only about you tell what is my argument and why my argument is good, but you also need to directly compare that why your argument is not only good, but better than your opponent's argument, right? And why it is something that need to be valued the most within the debate. Okay, move. All right, we're going to start to talk about the speaker roles because we're going to have like 6 debater and 8 speaker in a debate. So let's start with PM and LO. The speaker that start the case in government bench and the one that start this case in opposition bench. So what you need to do are 2 things. First, create a stance, and second of all, deliver your argument. So what is stance? Stance is all about the issues that made the motion arise and your point of view or your takes on that issues and what you want to do with that. Which means if you're a PM, what you need to do is that first you need to create the definitions. Second of all, you need to explain the root problem and the root issues in status quo or basically the background. And thirdly, if it's necessary in any kind of practical motion that tell you to make a proposal or impose a proposal, most of the time it requires some models or how you're going to operationalize the motions and how you're going to do it. But yeah, it depends on any kind of motions that you're going to get. Secondly, if you're an LO, you probably do not need to do definitions, or you don't need to tell all of the root problem background issues, because I think that PM supposedly have done that job. But what you need to do is that pick the right stance. So it's in opposition. There are three kind of approaches that you could take when you become oppositions. First of all, after you listen to the problem that was arised by the prime minister, you have a choice to, like, one, sticking with the status quo, which means that you're going to explain that, yeah, you do agree with the problem, but why the status quo mechanism and everything you're having right now is enough, for an example, to solve these issues. Or second of all, you could explain that, yeah, probably the status quo is not enough, but probably we could improve the status quo until we should not go to that extent of creating the entire new proposal. Or the last approach is that you're going to agree that, yes, the status quo is problematic. The mechanism that we're having right now is not enough. But then you're going to give a counterfactual or counter proposal. So instead of agreeing with the proposal that the proposition team proposed, you choose to have your own way to solve that issues, which also would add burden to your team to explain that why your counter proposal, what looks like, the models of it, and how you're going to operate it, and etc. And then you also get into the argument. You need to start to explain what you believe the most important thing in the debate according to the motion, and the stance that you're going to support. And as an LO, before you get into all of your argument, you still have one extra responsibility, which is to respond to the PM argument. So yeah, you need to rebut them. You need to discharge their argument before you get into your argument. Next. The deputies, which mean the second speaker of each team, the second speaker of the government or deputy prime minister, and the second speaker of opposition, deputy leader of oppositions. So the very first thing that you need to do is that you need to do response. You need to rebut them, which means that you need to provide the key direct responses to the opposing team, especially the speakers that talk before you. Second of all, what you need to do is that strengthen your team, or generally people call it as bring in an extension, for example, which means you need to provide additional argument that support or oppose a motion based on your team stance. Ideally, it is something that your previous speaker has not established yet, or what we call as extension. But if it's not something that entirely new, you probably may add additional layers or points to support your teammates' explanations. So yeah, that's what the deputies should do. Moving on is that the whips, or the third speaker of each team, what you need to do are two things. You need to rebuild and you need to destroy your opponent's case. So yeah, you work in a two-way, in the way of constructive manner to construct your team's case again, and in destructive manner in the way for you to destroy your opponent's case. So in a constructive way, what you need to do is that you need to summarize and strengthen your team case. Summary is just as important as response, because especially if the summary can help the judge compare your team with the opponent. So yeah, you need to do a lot of comparison here. Second of all, you may also provide additional explanations, characterizations, example, as long as they still manifest in the same conclusion laid out by your member to support their argument and extensions. So in whip speeches, you're not allowed to bring the entirety new argument with the different conclusions, with the different manifestation, with the entire speakers before you has established. But it's not going to be fair for the other team, because the airtime that they have to prepare the response for that entirely new material is not going to be enough. Secondly, destructive manner is that in terms of responses and rebuttal, which means you need to provide the key and the final responses to the previous speaker, as you are literally the last person who could do that. For an example, government whip, you should really respond to the LO, and if you're opposition whip, you really need to respond to government whip. You may also structure a response in a way that summarizes the comparison between your team and your opponent, because sometimes you do not really need to separate between the summary and responses. Probably you could make it as one, or most of the people call it as a clash. For example, you lay down the framework of the issues and why you're going to win in the both manner of constructive and destructive way. All right, Booth. Now we talk about the speaker that only have the half time of the other speaker reply speeches. So what you need to do in reply speech, just because the name is reply speech, it doesn't necessarily mean that what you do is just reply everything that the previous speaker has said before, because I think it's kind of not necessary, because judges already understand that, they already put it in their note. So what you need to do is that to provide the bias adjudication regarding the debate. How to do that is that you should or could address these several questions, and of course you should answer it, right? So yeah, there are several questions that you should address that will also help you to create bias adjudication and make a good reply speech. First, you need to explain that why your team should win the debate. Secondly, what is the metrics of judgment, which means that you need to put a parameter on what parameter the judge should weigh the debate. For example, based on your bias adjudication, you should make the judges favor your argument even more. Thirdly, you need to explain why your team's argument is the most important. Fourthly, why your team's response is the strongest. And the last but not least, this is the most tricky and the fun part of being a reply speech, that you're able to point out what are the crucial problems of your opponent's case and why that is very destructive toward their case, which mean that why your case is better than their case, for an example. All right, that's replies. After we talked about the speaker roles, we're going to talk about the different kind of motions, for an example. Let's start with the first one, which is the analysis motions. Analysis motion usually start with THBT, or this house believe that, or THO, this house oppose, or THS, or this house supports, which means this kind of motion requires you to assess whether the value of certain element, item, object, etc. is more positive or negative from neutral observer perspective or third-party perspectives. And most of the time, it does not ask for logistical or feasibility requirement. For example, this kind of motion are this house belief that private university bring more harm than good, for example. Next. I think we skipped a slide before analysis motion. And next, this is the other type of motion, which is a policy motion. Usually start with THW, or this house wall. The house in the motion is the parliament of the state, which means the focus of this debate is whether or not the policy should be implemented. So it is usually, it's not about why X bring more harm than good or otherwise, but why the value achieves a specific threshold to compel the actor or the states to do something, for example. Usually it requires you to create a certain modelings or the way for you to implement it. And what does it mean by emotions that will focus on this is the motion that do not care about whether or not the motion will pass within the parliament, because everyone should agree and concede that this motion will be passed in parliament, but whether or not the implementation of this motion will achieve the purpose or solve the issues that become the background of the debate. The example of this motion is that this house will ban the private universities. Next. Yep, another type of motion is that regrets motions, or THR, this house regret. The debate should be about assessing whether the world will be a better place with or without thesis stated in the motion. Thesis mean like the wording within the motions. So in THR motion is that teams have a benefit of hindsight, which means that you have an awareness about what is going on right now. Then you can compare about why what is going on right now is not that good. That's why you regret the existence of this kind of world and what you want to do about it next. And then in the regret motion, the government team or affirmative is expected to provide an antithesis of the world wherein such element does not exist. Most of the time, debater made a common mistake in the regret motion because most of the time they only show an argument by explaining that why several things is really that bad, that's why you want to regret it and such, without necessarily explain that without those things that you regret, how the world on your side would looks like. That is the reason why there's a massive absence of portrayal of the world on the government team if you do not give an antithesis, for an example. But just because you're able to give an antithesis doesn't necessarily mean that you can definitely fiat the antithesis by saying that, oh, the world on your side of the house will be very nice, very good, and very utopic, for an example. You still have a burden to explain the likelihood of such antithesis to be good, for an example. The simple example of this is that this has regard the prevalence of private university in Indonesian educational ecosystem, which means if you want being a government team here, instead to only explain that why private university in Indonesia right now is bad, but you also need to explain about if you do not have the private university in Indonesia, that what you want to do and why that world is better than our current world where we still have private university in Indonesia. Next. The other type is prefers motions or THP, this house prefer. The debate should be about the extent of which a statement is true, considering the element being discussed or stated in the motion. Considering that this type of motion usually follow with a world in which, so this house prefer a world in which, blah, 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 and the opposition cannot provide an alternate new world. The debate is all about comparison. Because if you say that you prefer something, that this must be something else that you prefer more and prefer less, which is the comparative is already clear. For example, if the motion say that this house prefer a world in which means that this house prefer a new world, so the comparative should be a or that new world versus the current status quo world that you're having right now. Except the motion clearly stated that this house prefer A over B or world A versus world B, then the comparative is not A versus the status quo, but A versus B. So it depends on what the motion stated. And the example of this motion is that this house prefer a world in which the educational system is entirely run by states, which means the government team need to affirm or should support that kind of world, and the opposition should defend the world in status quo right now when the educational system is not entirely run by state because you still have private involvement, for example. Next. The other type of motion is that actor motions. Most of the time start with the word as blah, 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 this has pull, this has believe that, this has oppose, this has support. So it's kind of a combination of other type of motions, but you add a specific actor that you want to talk about. Because in other kind of motions, you could explore any kind of actors that you want to talk about, but in the actor motion, you should only specifically talk about a certain actor that was stated in the motions, or probably other actor that's still related to the interest of this respective actor, for example. So the debate is not on whether or not the motion is true from the perspective of the stated actor, not from the neutral perspective anymore. And the teams must consider the stipulated actor's knowledge, value, and interest in regards to the motion. The example of this is that as public university, this house will actively call for the abolishment of private university. Next. Yep, as what I promised previously at the very beginning of the presentation, let's talk about definition. Definition is not translation. That is the first thing that you need to understand. So you need to understand that there are certain words that need to be defined, and there are some words that don't need to be defined. For example, this house as Indonesia government would like to impose an affirmative action for women in parliament. What you need to define, you do not need to define what is Indonesia. For example, you don't need to define about what is women, for an example. What you need to define is that what is affirmative action? How you're going to do that, for an example, because definition is only required for a word that have a multiple variety of understanding and meaning based on the context, for an example. So teams are expected to debate at the level of generality implied in the motions. And yeah, in definition, it should also assume that debate takes place in any functional democracy. Teams can definitely do several things. First, exclude a fringe example. Secondly, define a detailed mechanism to implement the motions if it's necessary. However, what you should not do is that include a fringe or anomalous example to support your case. Secondly, restrict the debate to a very specific setting without strong justification. This is also what happened a lot because most of the time suddenly debaters come up and say that, oh, this debate will happen in Indonesia, for example, because we are Indonesian people, we should debate in Indonesia, for example, without necessarily strong justification why this debate should only take place there. And thirdly, what you should not do is that to propose a mechanism that is not in line with the spirit of the motion, or most of the time we call it as a squirreling the motion. Next. But what you need to do, if you feel like the definition set by the Prime Minister was squirrel or fulfill all of the parameter to make us call the definition illegitimate, like what I explained before, what you need to do is that you can definitely do a definitional challenge, and it has to be done only by the leader of opposition in a very clear and explicit manner. So you should say that we want to do definitional challenge, right? You need to be assertive in order to do that. And teams can either choose to proceed with the original definition or propose an alternate definition with a strong justification. So you cannot simply say that you want to challenge a definition simply because you just not like it. But just because you want to have a new definition doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to create your own debate and just want to debate within your own definitions, because teams are expected to still engage on the main premises using the original definitions. So yeah, I mean that if you do not do this, you're going to have a government team talk in their own world. You're going to have your own world as well. So there's not going to be any responses, no engagement. It's going to be speech competition inside of debate competition, right? So yeah, this is also the problem of definitional challenge, because it will give you an extra burden. Now you're going to have, instead of one argument, you're going to have two arguments, the argument that works on their definition and the argument that works on your definition. Your responses instead of one, it's going to be two. So it's going to double your burden and should double your responsibility as well. That is the reason why definitional challenge should only be used as a last resort, for an example, because you do not want to make your life harder. You don't want to make the judge's life harder, for example. So yeah, this is just for the very, very worst scenario as your backup plan. And lastly, let's talk about Fiat. You might listen to me say Fiat before when I explained about the type of motions, but what is Fiat exactly all about? So Fiat is that when government team, like I explained before, may assume that the motion will pass the parliament. And second of all, therefore, argument about whether the parliament will pass the motion is not acceptable. And in case opposition team provide a mutually exclusive counterproposal, the field also applies. This applies in the policy motion when I say that opposition stance could be in the form of delivering or propose a counter mechanism or counter proposal. The field also applies. People should assume that the parliament also will pass the counter proposal provided by opposition, but the implementation and the result of it is still debatable. But what does it mean, mutually exclusive counterproposal? Mutually exclusive counterproposal means that the proposal that opposition team want to propose as a new proposal should come at the same amount of capital that the proposition would like to use within their own proposal. So you cannot make a counter proposal that probably costs extremely more than the proposal that the proposition already proposed previously, or you cannot give a counter proposal that need more political involvement rather than what affirmative proposed before. So what does it mean by mutually exclusive counter proposal is that in which both teams have an equal amount of resources, then you could have a different kind of proposal. That's it. Next. Yeah, I think that's the end of our presentation about debate briefing. Have a great runs. Thank you from us, Chia, Daud Muti, and Indy. Okay, see you on the next day on the IVED 2022. Bye-bye.